for accepting my presentation. I'm Christophe Mink. I come from Brussels, where I work in a governmental research department in the Ministry of Justice, and I work on the articulation between sociology of mobility and criminology and prison. First of all, what I will talk about is the problem of the legitimation of prison. It's a problem since the prison exists, and we have seen a lot of variation in the themes used to justify prison. Prison is really difficult to justify because you lock people inside a cell and let them rot for 10 years, so it's quite difficult in a democratic state to say it's really fine. And one of the traditions amongst the legitimation of prison is counterintuitive justifications, like we will be rehabilitating people by putting them in a disturbing place, or we will reinsert them in a society through isolation. So it's not new that we try to justify prison in some weird ways. And the legitimation of prison is a Sisyphus labor. It's never ended because every justification has failed. So we have to find new legitimations. And what I'm working on is the parliamentary documents of the new Belgian penitentiary law. It's really difficult for a French-speaking people to say that. Penitentiary law. So this is our first penitentiary law in 2005. And there's a huge amount of discussions and a huge report of a commission about it. And they try to envision a new prison which would be legitimate in the 21st century. What's the problem? How would I characterize the problem of the prison legitimation today? It's the problem of legitimizing the immobilization of people. We are depriving persons of physical mobility behind the wall and in a cell, so smaller than the prison wall. The time in prison is a time lost. The punishment doesn't require any process to come about. It's just perfect by the deprivation of time. In the origin, the classical vision of prison is just to put you in a cell and wait for 5, 10 years, 20 years, your whole life. We don't expect anything to happen. Something can happen, but it's a plus. It's not necessary. So it's painful immobilization in a total institution which is abolishing autonomy. And that can be legitimate in a society that praises encourage so the location of people in a very specific position and discipline. But can it be legitimate in a mobilitarian society? What's a mobilitarian society? I will tell you a little bit later. This is a fail. It comes from Keynote to PowerPoint, so there are some problems. So, never mind. It was an abstract from the parliamentary document saying that prison is a total institution and that's a problem. And we should try to normalize life in prison by opening it as much as possible and by defining carceral itineraries which are very personal and which are aimed at the liberation of people. Liberation? Is that correct? Okay, fine. So, mobilitarian. I cannot explain this for a quarter because I only have a quarter, but it's a theory that I explained in the book you talked about. It's just the idea that we live today in a society that praises mobility for itself. It's based on the representation of time as a flow, a continuous flow, and of space as a network. Change and movement are seen today as irrepressible, and mobility has become an obligation in material and non-material spaces, which means you have to move in your country or in the world, but you also have to socially move and to move in your conceptions, in your visions of life, in your trainings, and so on. I have defined 4 imperatives linked to this ideal, which are activity, activation, participation, and adaptation. We will talk a little bit more about this later. What proposes the new Belgian law? It proposes 4 general principles. Limiting of the harm, and this works, you see. Limiting of the harm, it's a principle that comes from the idea that it's an illusion to think that depriving someone of his liberty can have positive effects if you don't do anything to prevent harms caused by detention itself. It seems obvious, but it's a recognition that detention is the problem. So if you want the detainees to have a positive state of mind, you have to cope with those harms caused by detention. Second principle, normalization, which means that you have to do everything to make the life experience inside prison similar to the life outside of prison. I'm sorry it's in French, but I didn't have time to translate it. I will do it for some other presentation. Respect and responsibility, both in the same principle. That means that one key issue is to make people responsible for their own life, the life of their relatives, responsible for the harm caused to the victim and the harm caused to the family of the victim. If you want to make the people responsible, you have to respect them. So you see that they have to be responsible and they have to be respected in order to become responsible. And last principle is participation, which is really important in this law. They always say that everything must be participatory. And one good example is the detention plan. When someone comes into prison, he is asked to make a plan about his detention, to make a project, and to participate in the shaping of his own punishment. So, a few questions. What causes harm in a mobilitarian society? What is normal and what is abnormal? What is respect if it's linked to responsibility and not just an independence principle? And participation, that was a mobilitarian imperative, no? Yes, it was. And how does the legislator try to legitimize incarceration? First, by coming from detention to transition. First, it's about reducing the mobilization of the inmates. For instance, they insist on the limitation of imprisonment to a mere deprivation of physical mobility. The punitive characteristic of the detention lies in the total loss or partial loss of freedom of movement and restrictions to the liberties that are linked to this situation. Nothing can be added to this situation which is not already included in detention. That's quite a new principle for Belgium. But also they try to compensate physical immobility through an increased access to goods and services. So you're not really immobile if services and goods and persons can access to you or you can access to them. The inmates has the right to benefit from health care equivalent to those yeah, outside of the prison. I will go a little bit faster, it's too long. They also insist on the need to open the prison to the people, to the healthcare, to the goods, but also to the visits, and also open on the other side, facilitate the movement towards the outside world. Prison is also presented as a crossroad. You're not really incarcerated if prison is not a closed building. If prison is just a crossroad where people meet on their penal trajectories, it has another significations than letting you rot in a cell. So that's not real immobilization. Why should we legitimate immobilization if prison isn't really a clear immobilization? So yes, I'm coming to it. Another attempt is to mobilize inmates. The prison can no longer be a total institution, said the Commission. So, what's the consequence of this activity? Prison time cannot be wasted. It must be the occasion for work with the prisoner, for restorative justice, detention plan, training, curing physical or mental diseases, and so on. So that's a process going on inside the prison. And this process is not a passive process. The inmate is active. You have to ask him to do something. He is the initiator of reparation. You propose something, and he has to accept and to make something positive out of this. Participation. The prison penalty is a participatory project. I told you about the detention plan. If you make a plan out of your detention, you're not passive. You are just defining how you will be punished. And this is really strong in the new law. You are not just an object in the hands of an administration. You are finally the one defining the very meaning of the punishment. And they say it, they tell it in the documents. They say there is no common goal, no meaning. The meaning of the punishment has to be defined by the prisoner because it's his punishment, not ours. And finally, adaptation. This is an opening to tailor-made punishments. And they even say that judges don't even know what will happen after we begin we put people in jail. They condemned these people, but they really don't know what will happen. What will happen will be defined later by the prisoner, by the administration, and also by judges dedicated to this part of the punishment. So the prisoner is no longer passive. He's not waiting for the end of his time. He's a mobile individual. Isn't he free? This is an hypothesis, but I'm just wondering if in a society praising mobility for itself, but without any intention to abolish prison, cannot a solution be a symbolic abolition of prison? By proclaiming the restriction to physical immobility and considering prison as a crossroad and urging the detainees to conform to a mobilitarian ideal, prison is no longer a scandal if it becomes a mobility promoter. That's a question, not a conclusion. Thank you.
Any questions at all? Yeah, we start with
So, I mean, I'm turning over this question of, is the prisoner unfree if they're mobile and participant in this way? And maybe I'm missing the point, but I get the feeling almost that what your argument is exposing is a potential contradiction in how we think about mobility. The idea of it being about movement in that context of power. There's a point at which somebody can have the power to control their own movement, but at the same time still not be self-determining. Mm-hmm. Because the prisoner is not self-determining. They're not autonomous, they're not sovereign, because they have to participate in this prison-like system. Yeah. So is that really what we're seeing here? I guess yeah. I'm just speculating. Is that what we're seeing? Are we actually seeing kind of a breakdown in the concept that it can hit a point where mobility becomes so detached from that sort of that personal autonomy that the measure of power doesn't really do the things that kind of work?
Yeah, I made an intervention. Was it here 2 years ago? I don't know. Freed from mobility, freed by mobility, and freed from mobility. And the idea here, I think, is that we continue to associate freedom and movement, but it comes from a time when it was really difficult to move and where you had to find a justification for your movement. But in a society where movement is everywhere and where mobility is compulsory, it's no more freedom to be mobile. So you can be mobile without wanting to. An example is electronic monitoring, where you see people demanded to move, to go out of prison, to look for a job, to look for an apartment, and so on. They have to be outside of their home from this time to this time, but they have to be back, and so on. So it's more about controlled mobilities. And some of them want to get back to prison, where they say it's way more simple. I know that I cannot move, but everything now is clear. So I think we should think about mobility apart from freedom and ask the question of when are we free when we move and where aren't we? Because we are not free to stop, and that's a point too. We are not free to say, I will just wait here.
I'll just take one more.
I have a
question, if that's okay?
Yeah, I was curious about how this is sold to the public, if they're embracing this legislation.
The legislation, it's really difficult. A lot of the detainees, you have to know that the detention plan, 13 years after the law, isn't applied. So it's a big problem. And the detainees want this detention plan because they have something to ask for trainings or I don't know what, but they want to participate. But the officers didn't agree because it's really heavy for them. There were also strikes around the disciplinary part of the legislation, and I'm not convinced that this will change anything inside the walls of the prison. The next step of my research would be to go and interview and observe inside the prison to know if they changed the way they treat inmates, the way they organize things. I think also that what the history of prisons learns us is that the discourse is changed, but the buildings are really strong, and the culture the professional culture and the practices are really difficult to change. They will change, they will evolve, but I think really, really slowly, and I'm not convinced that this will be a reality before the next, maybe.
Okay, thanks. And we'll take
Thanks a
some
lot.
questions in the break. Thank you.